And now our guest orator, Julian Unwin, CBE. So a lady who is very, very busy. Please make welcome our very special guest, Julia Unwin, CBE.
Thank you, David, for that generous introduction. And thank you for inviting me to give this oration to a woman whose life we all celebrate today, who I never met, I know many of you never met, but who seems to me, in the way she lived her life and what she left at the end of her life, to typify so much that is so powerful about philanthropy. Margaret Lawrence was born in 1914 as the world hovered on the edge of the most catastrophic war. My foundation, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, was set up in 1904, 10 short years before then, by a businessman, Joseph Rowntree, who left us two parallel legacies. He left us housing, good quality housing for the people of York. People who'd lived in slums were rehoused. And he left us an intellectual legacy of inquiry, of finding out. To this day, we search out the reasons for social problems. We demonstrate solutions by running the housing. And we aim to influence lasting social change. Our very trust deed tells us to go forth and change the face of England. We don't worry about talking about social change. But when you contemplate the life of someone like Margaret Lawrence and the century, or close to century, she lived with, you can't help but think about the speed and depth of social change. 1914, a catastrophic war. 1919, Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, founded here in this city, to show local philanthropy what it could do to help people so dislocated by war. And then in the 1920s, perhaps our first example of a global financial crisis, our first recognition that finance could work for good for sure, but could destabilise and could threaten in ways that perhaps before that none of us had ever expected. And then as Margaret Lawrence came of age, the Second World War, that enormous cataclysm for the world that changed everything, for everybody for so long, and in which, in the brief biography I've read, she seems to have played a very significant part. At the end of that war, that process of resettlement and re-establishment, the foundations of our welfare state in the UK, and your very rich network of solidarity and social support, all this she would have witnessed. An unusual woman in her time, an unusual woman even now, living through this very fast-changing society and focusing her considerable personal wealth on the common good. And so therefore, a cause for celebration certainly. A moment to pause and to think of the remarkable changes she'd seen in her life. Because through that century, we saw the transformative role of women, the changing role of women, hugely, dramatically changed society forever. And at the same time, and not unconnected, the changing shape of family life, the ways we now live, our expectations, our hopes, and our aspirations. The huge rise in manufacturing in this country, which established, and I think has been the envy of the world, a stable, established, long-serving, blue-collar, working class, earning sufficient on which to live, on which to lead a decent life. The bedrock of Australian society, now deeply threatened. And of course, the establishment of all the organisations of the state and of charity that together, in my country and in yours, have provided a platform on which people can build their lives. The founder of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation believed most strongly that if people had the basics of a decent home, a job which they could rely on, an income, not necessarily lavish, but an income which they could subsist on, they could do all things. As a Quaker, he believed there was someone in God in everyone. The 1945 settlement across the Western world started to give us some of the basics for that sort of settlement. And since then, what do we see? The most dramatic change that any of us could imagine in the period since then. The huge changes which we're wrestling with as we speak today. The major changes in demography. The fact that Margaret Lawrence lived for a good long age, but now we predict that most of us will. that fewer of us are having children, so the shape of our populations, not just in the UK, not just in Australia, but in all the advanced and developed world, is now a different population. A population where, yes, we need to celebrate the great old age and the continuing contribution people can make, but also recognise the costs alongside the opportunities, the risks if we get it wrong. And it's not just a change of demography in terms of age, it's also our growing disabled population. The Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation was established and supported returning servicemen with all their many injuries. Today, we have a population in which the wonders of medical science mean we have more people with profound and deep disabilities. We have more people living to a good age who would have died in babyhood. We have people living in our community with fluctuating medical conditions. And indeed, we face that Western epidemic of mental illness. That demographic change challenges us all in everything we do. But it is not alone in the changes we face. We also struggle with the impact of climate change. Wherever you stand on the spectrum of the causes of climate change, nobody now denies that our planet threatens us. It threatens us with sudden crises, with rapid shocks and changes. In my country, we lived through floods earlier this year, which nobody expected to see. You've suffered fire on a horrendous scale. Across the world, the climate is fighting back and is telling us that there will be crises, there will be change. We have to be ready for future shock. So population, climate. The force of globalisation, that very big process that, as one of our cabinet ministers once said, is a bit like the weather. You can't stop it, but you do need to stop and understand it. That movement of money, that free movement of money, following a free movement of labour, has changed our world forever. And I don't need to tell people in Australia of the huge impact of globalisation, again, for good, for ill, challenging many of our preconceived notions, creating a world, as Joseph Rantry, Margaret Lawrence and others would simply not have recognised, a different world, a world in which deference and trust are no longer automatic, and many of us would say that's a good thing, that we no longer ascribe to people of greater wealth, greater respect. We no longer think that there are people who are above us in society. We no longer trust the big institutions in our society. In my country, we don't trust the bankers anymore. We don't, and nor would you if you came from the UK. We tend not to trust our politicians in the way that we used to. We're withdrawing trust from our churches, from our trade unions, from our institutions. For all sorts of good and powerful reasons, we all now believe we have the right to challenge and to speak up and to talk differently about the powers and the structures in our society. And this has been enormously enhanced and improved by the massive digital revolution, which I suspect Margaret Lawrence could never have imagined, because indeed none of us can. We still cannot imagine the power and the impact of that digital revolution and what it will do to us. I said at a gathering last week that I remember my late grandmother saying to me, "Do you know, Julia, I think one day there'll be a computer in every town." If she had lived to see a computer in every bedroom in my family home, let alone computers in your pockets at the moment, I guarantee most people in this room will have one bleeping away. The power of communication, the speed of communication, our powers to analyse data, our powers to understand, to dig deep, would have thrown Joseph Rantry, who believed very profoundly that if only we could capture enough information, get enough research, get enough knowledge, we could change everything. Well, we now have that data. We can analyse it hugely deeply. Governments and Google can know more about us than we could ever expect to. I suspect the supermarket in which I shop knows more about my life than many people close to me. We have moved into a digital age which we thought, and I remember thinking, would change how we did most things. What I didn't know, and I think none of us knew, was that it would change what we did too. It would change how we view institutions, how we view power. It would change the voices that people have and the ways the dispossessed can speak. It would change the way in which rumour gets around the world before truth has got its boots on. It would change the way that government is viewed. It would change things in a way that we still can't envisage. I was interviewing somebody recently, a young woman who's very heavily involved in the digital world, and I said, "Tell me, what's your next job going to look like?" And she looked at me and said, "My next job hasn't been invented yet." And I thought, cheeky answer, very clever response, because actually the pace of change is now such that we don't understand what's happening next. And those of us, and I'm one, who are digital second, maybe third language speakers, have to respect the native speakers in the digital world and recognise how much it is changing and will continue to change. And a labour market that looks so different from the labour market to which Margaret Lawrence grew up and indeed contributed. A labour market which does now have the participation of women, but is perhaps more deeply divided than at any time in our most recent history. A labour market in which people do difficult, part-time and dangerous jobs, and others, and I include myself, do wonderful, interesting and inspirational jobs. A very different world indeed. But this level of change is nothing new. The speed is no doubt daunting, but Margaret Lawrence would have understood because she lived through a century of change. And it's not a new challenge for philanthropy, because what is philanthropy except the creation of permanent goods to live through change? The notion that an endowment is gathered for one generation and passed to another, that the balance for philanthropists is always balancing the requirements of generations today with generations tomorrow, and understanding that fantastically important part of generational wealth transfer, not for the benefit of our sons and daughters, but for the benefit of future generations, is the heart and soul of our philanthropy. So philanthropy is comfortable with change. Philanthropy knows it needs to adjust. Philanthropy has never, ever been able to stay still. And I believe, and I'm going to argue, that this is now philanthropy's time. We are in the process of creating a new, unspoken, as yet unarticulated or poorly articulated new social settlement, as government redefines its purpose, as the market, the ever mightier market, sometimes bigger than government, certainly bigger and more powerful than nation states, flexes its muscles. And the Bank of England's governor yesterday warned that we might be beginning to breach our old social contract because we have businesses and banks that are simply too big to fail. A social contract in which the community sector is thinking, what does this mean for us? What does this mean for individual families, people as they struggle to make their lives? A time of huge change must be the moment for philanthropy to rally and to say, this is our time. We bring with us great wealth, of course, and wealth we have committed to use wisely and carefully in the interests of generations today and future generations. But not just wealth. We bring rich contacts, we bring rich networks, we bring knowledge. Maya Angelou, who we also honour today because her death was reported today, once said that the wise woman is no one's enemy, but no one's victim either. I suspect Margaret was no one's enemy, but no one's victim either. I also suspect that philanthropy needs to recognise that it can make friends, it can build alliances, but it is no victim. It has power and privilege that others lack. There is something extraordinarily privileged about philanthropy. We do have to look at the stock market, but we don't have owners who can tell us what to do. We have to invest our money carefully, but we make our own choices on that. We're not subject to the political cycle, and we don't have customers. That privilege, I think, brings huge responsibility. And the responsibility of philanthropy in our fast-changing society as we move towards a new, and I suspect very different, 21st century social compact, comes in various forms. And I want to end by talking about the strengths of philanthropy, but also the responsibilities. Because wise philanthropy, skillfully applied philanthropy, intelligent philanthropy, can indeed change the world. Careless philanthropy, whimsical philanthropy, philanthropy that just follows fashion, follows whims, is so much wasted money, so much wasted effort, and more critically than that, betrays the next generation, because it's the next generation we need to be working for. So I would argue that good philanthropy is always connected. It has deep connections within communities, within the place where it works. That place-based philanthropy has a power and a strength that we must never underestimate. That community-based philanthropy understands the community of interest or the community of place and has rich and deep connections. It doesn't stand aloof. It makes those links and gets engaged. Engaged, connected philanthropy is incredibly powerful. So too is the collaboration of philanthropy. The ability to collaborate across borders, across sectors, to work with organisations that are entirely different from you. It is not too difficult for a wealthy philanthropic foundation to fund the organisations that look exactly like it, to invest in the institutions which we can understand. The challenge is to invest and support and collaborate with those organisations that are different, that threaten us, that make us think differently. So connected, collaborative. You'll see a theme in a minute. Because good philanthropy is also committed. It's committed for the long term. It's not neutral. It doesn't stand on the sidelines. It doesn't just say, we'll fund this for a bit and then we'll drop it. It makes a commitment to an issue. My own organisation describe ourselves as fiercely independent, but never neutral. We are not neutral about poverty. We don't think it's interesting. We think it's a scar across our nation. We are committed to ending poverty. We retain and protect our independence at all costs, but we work in partnership with others, and we are committed for the long term because we are here for future generations. Philanthropy has knowledge, and it needs, just like the best museum, to curate that knowledge, to manage that knowledge, to bring that data together. Very often in our fast-changing government world, and this has certainly been the UK experience, it has been philanthropy that has held the knowledge, that has known things as government has laid off huge members of staff, defunded organisations we expected to hold the knowledge. The curation of knowledge, not just facts for their own sake, but an understanding of how things work. Who knows how things work? Who is strong in the community? What are the changing connections and issues in the community? That's what good philanthropy does. And it challenges, it critiques, it holds to account. It says we have learnt from our funding. We have learnt through our long and patient funding that what is happening to women suffering domestic violence is simply not acceptable. We challenge that because we have the knowledge. And the mandate we have as philanthropic organisations is not because we're rich. That gives us no mandate at all. It's because of what we know. It's the evidence we have collected. The evidence we've collected from research in the case of my organisation, the evidence from the lived experience of the organisations you stand side by side with. That gives us a mandate to challenge carefully, intelligently, based on evidence, never carelessly. But that notion of philanthropy holding the government to account, business to account, indeed the community to account, because of what we know, because we have power, because of what we know. My final, last but one C, philanthropy can also create. It is too often seen as if social problems are an issue of dry, dusty intervention. But actually, the artistic inspiration that Margaret Lawrence sought is also the inspiration that gets so many of our greatest social projects off the ground, that recognises that people in poverty need beauty too, need to see the joy of life, that the notion that housing built for poor people should always be poor housing is something I would reject entirely. That creativity in the search for solutions, in the willingness to take risks, in the willingness to say this might not work, but you know what, we'll take the risk. That creativity requires my final C, which is courage. Because philanthropic organisations, with the privileges they have, with their long-term stake in society, need to bring courage to these very big issues that we face. If we're timid, if we say we can't really help, if we say, quite truthfully, that the philanthropic cent is so much less than the taxpayer dollar, we're wasting our potential and the gift we bring for future generations because we are not using our fantastically rich networks, our endowments and the donations we get given to drive the sort of social change that our modern society will need. I think Margaret Lawrence would have applauded those challenges to philanthropy. I think she would have understood them because she also took brave steps in her own life. The bravest step of all, leaving a bequest which you ask others to spend. That's the honour many of us in philanthropy have inherited from all sorts of other brave, courageous donors. And I think that gives us a challenge in this very daunting, very fast-moving 21st century, where inequality risks ripping our communities apart, where poverty is a scar on many of our communities, where we are paying a huge cost because of the economic damage being done. That's why I say this is now philanthropy's time to say we can do this very much better. Thank you, and thank you for asking me to do this oration.